to $10 to $20, you're going to come way down to 20. We don't want to do that. Now, in all fairness, no other president even tried. But if they did try, there was actually a fake story in stupid USA Today. I didn't even think they make it anymore. I haven't. But I saw a story where Biden was trying to do this. Biden never tried to do it. Biden didn't know he was alive. He never tried to do it. But they're taking it from $10 to 20. So he would say, and the other leader said the same thing. No, we won't do it. They said, no, you're going to do it 100%. They said, nope. We're not doing it. We're not going to double our price. Because, again, if you go from $10 to $20, they're doubling their price. We're coming now, though, from $130 to $20, because we're going to get the lowest drug prices in the world. Whatever the lowest price is called favored nations, we're going to have the lowest price.
Did you hear what that man just said? Did you hear the words that just spilled from the mouth of someone who holds himself up as the legitimate victor of American democracy? A man who sits behind a desk draped in the trappings of power and tells you with absolute conviction that another human being did not even know he was alive. This is not merely political theater. This is not just another spicy soundbite for the algorithm to devour and regurgitate across our information ecosystem. This is the crystallization of something far more sinister and far more revealing about the state of authoritarian discourse in this catastrophic political moment we find ourselves inhabiting. And I want you to understand the stakes here, because what Trump just did in that rambling, incoherent screed about drug prices was not simply attack his opponent's policy record, but rather engage in a form of rhetorical dehumanization that has terrifying historical precedents and equally terrifying contemporary implications. Trump keeps making mathematically impossible promises about drug prices, declaring that his most favored nation policy will reduce prescription drug costs by 1,000% or more, which is literally impossible because if he got companies to reduce prices to zero, that would be a 100% cut, and cutting by more than 100% would mean Americans get paid to acquire Medicaid Yet here he is spinning this fantastical narrative where he alone wrestled foreign leaders into submission and forced them to capitulate to American patients, while Biden just sat there in some vegetative stupor not knowing he was alive. The audacity of this mendacity is breathtaking, but what should concern us even more profoundly is the existential erasure embedded in that phrase, the way Trump casually strips another human being of consciousness itself, of the basic threshold of existence, because when you declare that someone does not know they are alive, you are engaging in eliminationist rhetoric that positions your opponent not as wrong or misguided or even corrupt, but as literally non-sentient, as something less than human, as an object rather than a subject of history. Now let me connect this to what is actually happening with prescription drug policy, because the lies here are stacked so high they blot out the sun, and we need to excavate them systematically, to understand how authoritarian leaders use policy fabrication as a vehicle for personal aggrandizement, opposition destruction. Trump made the mathematically impossible claim that he was able to slash drug prices by as much as 400, 500, and even 600%, and when even Fox News hosts started fact-checking him, pointing out that cutting something by 100% reduces cost to zero, and cutting by 400, 600% would mean drug companies pay you to take their products, Parhez's Commerce Secretary tried to defend it with gibberish about looking at percentages from different directions, as if mathematics itself bends to the will of Trumpian reality distortion fields. This is gaslighting on an industrial scale. This is the construction of an alternative epistemic universe where facts are infinitely malleable, and the only thing that matters is the great leader's narrative supremacy. But here is what should alarm every person committed to healthcare justice in this country. Here is the bombshell that demolishes Trump's entire edifice of self-congratulation. The United States pays more for drugs because it is an outlier among high-income countries which predominantly support universal public health coverage, and researchers argue that meaningful solutions include restricting pharmaceutical monopolies, reworking insurance benefits to reduce out-of-pocket expenses, and recentralizing price negotiations through single-payer systems like Australia, Germany, and the UK. Do you see what is happening here? Do you understand the cosmic irony of Trump positioning himself as the savior of American patients, while the actual structural solution to pharmaceutical price gouging is the very kind of socialized medicine that he and his Republican enablers have spent decades demonizing as communist tyranny? The countries with low drug prices have low drug prices precisely because they have rejected the for-profit healthcare model that Trump worships. They have instituted the kind of government intervention and collective bargaining power that conservatives call the death of freedom, And here is Trump trying to take credit for threatening pharmaceutical companies into marginal price reductions while opposing the systemic reforms that would actually solve the problem. And let us be extraordinarily clear about what Biden actually accomplished versus what Trump is claiming, because Trump signed an executive order on drug pricing in May 2025, sent letters to pharmaceutical manufacturers in July, and has announced deals since September, which means this is happening right now in Trump's current administration. Yet he stands there claiming Biden never tried to do any of this, that Biden did not even possess consciousness during his presidency. This is revisionist history being written in real time. This is the authoritarian playbook of claiming credit for everything while attributing all failure and all inaction to your predecessors and your enemies. The USA Today story he dismisses as fake and stupid. This journalistic outlet he claims does not even exist anymore. As if wishing could unmake institutions, this represents his broader war on any information source that might contradict his narrative supremacy, his attempt to discredit not just individual stories, but the entire concept of independent journalism as a legitimate arbiter of factual reality. Now I want you to sit with the phrase "Biden didn't know he was alive" for a moment, because this is where we need to talk about ageism and cognitive ableism as weapons of authoritarian politics. And this is going to get uncomfortable, because the progressive movement has not always handled this conversation with the rigor and consistency it demands. Yes, Biden suspended his campaign in July 2024 after being pressured to withdraw due to concerns about his age and mental acuity. And yes, there were legitimate questions raised by people across the political spectrum about whether someone in their 80s should be running for another term. But there is a universe of difference between expressing concern about a candidate's fitness for the demanding responsibilities of executive leadership and declaring that a sitting president does not possess sentience, that he exists in some twilight zone between life and non-life. What Trump is doing here is not legitimate criticism of Biden's record or even harsh but fair assessment of his debate performances. What Trump is doing is constructing a narrative in which his opponent is literally not a person, not a thinking, feeling, conscious entity capable of agency or decision-making or moral responsibility. And the bitter, terrible irony here is that Trump is only 3 years younger than Biden was during that campaign. Trump at 78 will become the oldest U.S. president to assume office, yet he has successfully repositioned the age narrative to exempt himself from scrutiny while using it as a cudgel against his opponents. This is what fascist rhetoric does. It creates arbitrary hierarchies where the in-group is always vital and virile and powerful, while the out-group is always weak and decrepit and barely alive, regardless of objective reality. Trump can ramble incoherently about drug prices using percentages that violate basic mathematics. He can confuse countries and slur words and lose his train of thought mid-sentence, and his supporters will call it strategic brilliance or four-dimensional chess. But let Biden have a raspy voice or a verbal stumble, and suddenly he is non-sentient. Suddenly he does not know he is alive. Here is another bombshell for you. Here is the thing that should make you absolutely furious about how this healthcare conversation has been hijacked. On average, U.S. drug prices are 2.78 times higher compared with 33 other OECD countries, and 4.22 times higher for brand-name drugs, which means that Americans are being systematically exploited by pharmaceutical monopolies that charge us multiples of what patients in comparable wealthy nations pay. And the reason is not that those countries are subsidized by us as Trump falsely claims. The reason is that we have deliberately chosen a healthcare system that treats medicine as a commodity to be sold at maximum profit, rather than a human right to be guaranteed at cost. Every single day, people in this country are rationing insulin, skipping doses of life-saving medications, going into bankruptcy because they had the misfortune to get sick in a nation that views their suffering as a market opportunity. And Trump stands there spinning fairy tales about how he personally negotiated with foreign leaders and forced them to change their prices while dismissing anyone who actually tried to implement systemic reform as being literally unconscious. This brings us to the deeper horror of what Trump is articulating here, which is the strongman mythology that only he can solve problems, that policy is not the result of institutional processes or legislative negotiation or bureaucratic implementation, but rather flows directly from his personal will, his unique ability to intimidate and dominate and extract concessions through sheer force of personality. Listen to how he describes these supposed negotiations. I said no. No, you're going to do it 100%. They said nope, we're not doing it. I said no. No, you're going to. This is not governance. This is fantasy role play, where Trump imagines himself as the protagonist in some crude transactional drama, where his commanding presence alone bends reality to his desires. This is the politics of narcissistic omnipotence, the authoritarian's dream of unmediated power, unencumbered by constitutional constraints or institutional checks, or the messy realities of policy implementation. The actual executive order requires officials to determine pricing targets within 30 days, then gauge whether significant progress has been achieved, and if not, propose a rulemaking plan that could take months or even years, which is to say this is a normal bureaucratic process with uncertain outcomes that depends on regulatory procedures and potential litigation and pharmaceutical company cooperation, but Trump sells it as him personally telling foreign leaders what to do and them instantly complying because he is just that powerful. We are watching the construction of a fascist aesthetic in real time, and I use that word fascist deliberately and with full awareness of its historical weight, because what else do you call a politics premised on the cult of the leader, the elevation of personal will over institutional process, the dehumanization of opponents, the rejection of empirical reality, and the promise of national salvation through dominance and strength? The scholars who study authoritarian movements have been sounding the alarm for years about Trump's rhetoric and governing style, about the way he systematically attacks democratic norms and institutions, about his embrace of political violence and eliminationist language, and we have this perfect encapsulation of all those tendencies in this one clip where he simultaneously lies about policy, claims impossible victories, attacks the free press, dehumanizes his predecessor, and positions himself as the sole legitimate wielder of power. And you know what makes this even more maddening? What makes this even more of a gut punch to anyone who cares about healthcare justice? Some experts, including left-of-center commentators, offered measured praise for Trump's executive order, calling it a serious policy initiative that credible people think could bring some relief on drug prices. Economists said the possibility of 30 to 80% price reductions is plausible and roughly in line with research, which means that buried underneath all the lies and all the authoritarian posturing and all the mathematical impossibilities, there might actually be some potentially beneficial policy. But Trump cannot just do policy. Trump cannot just implement reforms that might help people and then let those reforms speak for themselves. Trump has to wrap everything in this narrative of personal domination and opponent destruction, but he has to inflate modest regulatory changes into world historical victories, and he has to position anyone who tried to do similar things as literally non-conscious. This is the tragedy of our political moment. This is what happens when we allow narcissistic authoritarians to hijack legitimate policy conversations for their personal aggrandizement. There are real people suffering because of pharmaceutical price gouging. There are real families making impossible choices between medication and rent. There are real human beings dying because they cannot afford insulin or cancer treatments or basic antibiotics. And instead of having a serious national conversation about how to fix our fundamentally broken healthcare system, we are watching Trump spin fantasies about his personal negotiations with foreign leaders while dismissing his predecessor as a vegetable. The spectacle consumes the substance, the performance replaces the policy, and the people who actually need help get lost in the noise. Let me take you deeper into what this "Biden didn't know he was alive" comment reveals about conservative politics and their relationship to power and truth. This is not just Trump being Trump. This is not just another example of his characteristic hyperbole or his loose relationship with factual accuracy. This is a window into how the right understands political conflict as fundamentally about dominance hierarchies rather than competing visions of the good society. When Trump says Biden did not know he was alive, he is not making a medical claim or even a particularly specific cognitive claim. He is asserting his own superior vitality and agency by contrasting it with Biden's supposed catatonia. This is alpha male posturing translated into political rhetoric. This is the social Darwinist worldview that divides humanity into winners and losers, predators and prey, those who matter and those who do not. And in Trump's cosmology, Biden does not just lose the comparison, Biden does not even register as a conscious agent worthy of recognition. The historical echoes here should terrify anyone with even a passing familiarity with how authoritarian movements have traditionally talked about their enemies. The dehumanization of opponents, the stripping away of their agency and consciousness, the positioning of them as objects rather than subjects. This is not just crude political attack. This is the rhetorical groundwork for eliminations politics. You do not need to compromise with someone who does not know they are alive. You do not need to consider their perspective or their constituency or their humanity. You simply need to remove them and install yourself as the legitimate authority. And before anyone accuses me of being hyperbolic or engaging in inflammatory rhetoric myself, I want to be very clear that I am not saying Trump is actively planning genocidal policies. I am saying that the rhetorical patterns he employs have dangerous historical precedents, and we would be foolish to ignore those patterns simply because we find them uncomfortable to name. Here is what should shake you to your core. In December 2024, a former CNN commentator apologized for not pushing harder for information about Biden's mental and physical decline, and the Wall Street Journal released a detailed report about how the White House functioned with a diminished Biden in charge, which means that there were real questions about Biden's capacity that the media and Democratic establishment may have downplayed or covered up during the campaign. This is genuinely concerning. This represents a failure of transparency and accountability, and progressives who care about democratic norms should be willing to grapple with this seriously. But the solution to that failure is not to embrace Trump's authoritarian lies and mathematical impossibilities and dehumanizing rhetoric. The solution is to demand better from all our leaders and all our institutions, to insist on rigorous, transparent assessment of candidate fitness, to build systems that do not depend on gerontocratic leadership structures where people in their 80s are running for the most demanding job in the world. We need to talk about the gerontocracy problem in American politics, about the way both parties have elevated septuagenarians and octogenarians to leadership positions while younger generations are locked out of power, about how this reflects deeper structural issues with money in politics and primary systems and the incumbency advantage. A New York Times Siena poll found that 61% of Democratic voters wanted someone other than Biden to be the 2024 nominee, citing his age as the main concern, which suggests that Democratic voters themselves recognize this problem, but the party infrastructure was too rigid and too invested in Biden's incumbency to course-correct until it was too late. This is a systems failure. This is what happens when we treat political office as personal property to be held until death or voluntary retirement, rather than as temporary stewardship that should be regularly renewed through vigorous competition. But again, and I cannot stress this enough, the solution to the Democratic Party's gerontocracy problem is not to embrace Trump's fascist rhetoric about Biden not knowing he was alive. The solution is structural reform, term limits, mandatory retirement ages for certain offices, reinvigorated primary processes, campaign finance reform that makes it possible for younger candidates without extensive donor networks to compete, all the unglamorous institutional changes that do not make for good television but actually shift power dynamics. Trump offers none of this. Trump offers only his personal dominance, his unique ability to see what others cannot see and do what others cannot do, and in exchange for believing in his supremacy, you get to participate vicariously in his victories over the weak and the decrepit and the barely conscious. This is the fascist bargain, in its purest form. Surrender your critical faculties, accept the leader's reality distortion, embrace his cruelty toward designated enemies, and in exchange you get to feel powerful and righteous and part of the winning team. It is a seductive offer, especially for people who feel left behind by economic change or cultural transformation or demographic shifts, people who want simple explanations for complex problems and clear villains to blame for their suffering. Trump gives them Biden as villain, Biden the barely conscious puppet who let pharmaceutical companies run wild, Biden who never even tried to help American patients because he was too busy being non-sentient, and in this narrative Trump becomes the hero who swoops in to save the day through sheer force of will. But here is the reality that this narrative obscures. Pharmaceutical companies have been price gouging Americans for decades under both Republican and Democratic administrations because we have a fundamentally broken system that treats healthcare as a for-profit enterprise rather than a public good. And the only way to actually solve this problem is through structural reform that challenges the power of those companies, that institutes the kind of price controls and negotiating leverage that every other wealthy nation uses, that ultimately moves us toward a universal healthcare system where medical treatment is a right rather than a commodity. Trump will never advocate for this because it would require challenging the very corporate interests that fund his campaigns and benefit from his tax cuts, so instead he spins elaborate fictions about his personal negotiations with foreign leaders and claims credit for marginal regulatory changes while attacking anyone who might actually threaten pharmaceutical profit margins as socialist tyrants who want to destroy America. This brings me to the media criticism embedded in Trump's rant, his dismissal of USA Today as stupid, and his claim that he did not even think they make it anymore. This casual attempt to wish an entire news organization out of existence because they published something that contradicted his narrative. This is part of the authoritarian playbook that we have seen play out over and over, the systematic delegitimization of any information source that might provide independent verification or fact-checking or accountability. Trump has spent years attacking the free press as fake news and enemy of the people, cultivating in his supporters a reflexive distrust of journalism that makes them immune to factual correction and dependent on him as their sole source of reliable information. When he says USA Today is stupid and maybe does not exist anymore, he is training his audience to dismiss any reporting from that outlet, to treat it as literally fictional, to accept only information that comes from Trump-approved sources. This is how you construct an authoritarian information environment. You systematically attack the credibility of independent institutions until your supporters exist in an epistemic bubble where only the leader's word counts as truth. We have seen this pattern in every authoritarian regime from 20th century fascism to contemporary illiberal democracies. The press is attacked, journalists are intimidated, fact-checking is dismissed as bias, and gradually the shared factual baseline that makes democratic deliberation possible disintegrates into tribal epistemologies where different groups literally live in different realities. Trump is accelerating this process every time he makes claims like saying USA Today maybe does not exist, every time he invents statistics that violate basic mathematics, every time he demands that his supporters believe his version of events rather than what they can observe with their own eyes. And the pharmaceutical companies are laughing all the way to the bank while this circus continues. They are absolutely delighted that the national conversation about drug prices has been hijacked by Trump's personal grievances and Biden's mental fitness rather than focusing on their monopoly power and their price gouging and their political influence. This is how corporate interests maintain their dominance in our political system. They encourage cultural warfare and personality conflicts and anything else that might distract from substantive policy debates about economic power. While we are arguing about whether Biden knew he was alive, pharmaceutical executives are calculating their profit margins and lobbying against any meaningful reform and extracting maximum revenue from a captive market of patients who need medication to survive. Here is what should make you absolutely enraged about this situation. Pharmaceutical manufacturers involved in Trump's announced deals are committing to invest at least $150 billion collectively in U.S. manufacturing. Which sounds impressive until you realize that this is exactly the kind of corporate-friendly deal-making that Trump loves. Big showy numbers and photo opportunities and announcements that make it look like he is delivering results while the fundamental structural problems remain unaddressed. The companies agree to invest money they were probably going to invest anyway. They get to position themselves as patriotic partners in making America great again. Trump gets to claim a victory, and the underlying system of pharmaceutical price exploitation continues basically unchanged. This is neoliberalism with nationalist rhetoric. This is corporate power dressed up as populist triumph. And it is exactly what we should expect from an administration that serves the interests of capital while pretending to fight for the common people. We need to connect this to the broader failure of American healthcare policy and the decades-long bipartisan refusal to implement the kind of universal system that every other wealthy nation has figured out. The United States is the only developed country where people go bankrupt from medical bills, where basic healthcare is tied to employment status, where insurance companies make billions while patients die from rationing medication. This is not an accident. This is not some unfortunate natural outcome. This is the result of deliberate policy choices made by politicians from both parties who have accepted pharmaceutical money and insurance money and hospital money and who have prioritized corporate profits over human lives. Trump is not some aberration from this system. Trump is the apotheosis of this system, the logical endpoint of treating healthcare as a business opportunity rather than a human right. And when progressives try to point this out, when we advocate for Medicare for all or single-payer systems or any structural reform that would actually solve these problems, we get attacked as radical socialists who want to destroy American healthcare. We get told that our ideas are too expensive or too disruptive or too foreign. We get dismissed by moderate Democrats and Republicans alike as unrealistic dreamers who do not understand how the real world works. But you know what is actually unrealistic. You know what actually does not work in the real world. The current system where pharmaceutical companies charge Americans multiples of what they charge patients in other countries, where insurance companies deny coverage for necessary treatments, where people die because they cannot afford insulin, where medical bankruptcy is a leading cause of personal financial ruin, that is what does not work. That is the failed experiment. That is the system that needs to be destroyed and rebuilt from the ground up. Trump's lies about drug prices are not just personal fabrications. They are ideological weapons designed to defend a fundamentally unjust system by creating the illusion of reform without actual structural change. He wants you to believe that the problem is bad deals and weak leaders, rather than the entire for-profit healthcare model. He wants you to think that his personal toughness can solve problems that actually require systemic transformation. He wants you to focus on Biden's supposed incompetence, rather than on the corporate interests that benefit from healthcare injustice. This is misdirection on a grand scale. This is three-card Monte where Trump keeps your attention on the dramatic shuffling while the real game is happening somewhere else entirely. Let me bring this full circle to where we started. To that phrase, Biden didn't know he was alive. and what it reveals about the stakes of this political moment. We are not just arguing about two old men and their respective fitness for office. We are not just litigating who gets credit for marginal drug price changes. We are fighting over fundamental questions about truth and power and what kind of country we want to be. Do we want a country where leaders are held accountable to factual reality, or one where they can invent their own statistics and dismiss anyone who fact-checks them? Do we want a country where policy debates focus on substantive solutions, or one where they devolve into personal attacks and dehumanizing rhetoric? Do we want a country where healthcare is a right, or one where it remains a commodity to be sold at maximum profit? These are the questions that should be animating our politics. These are the choices we need to make as a society. But Trump's authoritarian spectacle-making prevents us from having those conversations by constantly redirecting our attention to his personal grievances and his manufactured victories and his enemies' supposed inadequacies. This is not accidental. This is strategic. This is how authoritarians maintain power, by keeping everyone focused on the drama and the spectacle while they consolidate control and serve their donor interests and dismantle democratic institutions. Every minute we spend debunking Trump's mathematically impossible drug price claims is a minute we are not spending organizing for Medicare for all. Every minute we spend arguing about Biden's mental fitness is a minute we are not spending building power to challenge pharmaceutical monopolies. So here is what we need to do. Here is how we respond to this authoritarian moment. We name the lies. We identify the rhetorical patterns. We connect Trump's specific claims to the broader systems of power they serve. And then we pivot to affirmative vision, to the world we are trying to build, to the policies that would actually solve these problems. We refuse to be trapped in Trump's reality distortion field. We refuse to accept his terms of debate. We refuse to let his spectacle consume all the oxygen. We say yes, Trump is lying about drug prices, and yes, his dehumanization of Biden is dangerous, and yes, his attacks on the press are authoritarian, and yes, the pharmaceutical companies are exploiting us, and here is our plan for universal health care. Here is how we break up pharmaceutical monopolies. Here is how we ensure that no one in the richest country in human history dies because they cannot afford medication. This is the work. This is the unglamorous, difficult, necessary work of building political power and changing policy and transforming systems. It is not as emotionally satisfying as watching Trump get fact-checked. It is not as dramatically compelling as arguing about whether Biden knew he was alive. But it is what actually matters. It is what actually changes people's material conditions. It is what actually moves us toward justice. We need to stay focused on that work even as we document Trump's lies. We need to maintain strategic clarity about our goals even as we respond to his provocations. We need to remember that the point is not just to win arguments but to build power and implement policies and create the structural conditions for human flourishing. And we need to have uncomfortable conversations within the progressive movement about age and leadership and democratic accountability, about how we failed to push back forcefully enough when it became clear that Biden's age was going to be a liability, about how we need to build a bench of younger leaders and create pathways to power that do not require waiting for octogenarians to voluntarily step aside. We need to be self-critical and willing to learn from defeats and honest about our own shortcomings, even as we identify and resist the authoritarian threat that Trump represents. This is not contradictory. This is necessary. This is what it means to take democracy seriously, rather than treating it as team sports where you blindly defend your side regardless of their flaws. The stakes here are existential. The stakes here are whether we will have a healthcare system that treats people as human beings worthy of care, or one that treats them as profit centers to be exploited, whether we will have a political system that operates on factual reality, or one that submits to authoritarian reality distortion, whether we will have leaders who are accountable to democratic norms, or ones who position themselves as strongmen above institutional constraints. Trump's rant about Biden and drug prices crystallizes all these questions into one toxic package, and our response needs to be comprehensive and strategic and unflinching in its commitment to both truth and justice. We document the lies, we name the authoritarian patterns, we defend democratic institutions, and we build the power necessary to implement the structural reforms that will actually solve these problems. This is the work, this is the fight, this is what this moment demands from all of us who care about building a more just world.